Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Kenn Adams. Kenn is the artistic director of the improvisational theater company Synergy Theater and the author of the book How to Improvise a Full-Length Play, The Art of Spontaneous Theater. Kenn is also the reason that every child of my generation has been massively concerned that our toys are coming to life behind our backs and plotting against us when we don't treat them fairly. No, he didn't actually write Toy Story or work for Pixar, but he invented the story structure used in just about every single Pixar movie ever made. Now, it's probably a good thing that he can't take the blame for any of the Disney movies with their horribly sticky soundtracks and endless merchandise, or I'd really struggle to keep a civil tongue during this episode. Ladies and gentlemen, the master of improv himself, Kenn Adams. Kenn, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. What a generous introduction. Thank you.
So, that introduction, it's obviously something you've talked about a ton. I think just for people that have no idea what I'm talking about, the briefest of summaries is that you, without any connection to Pixar, I think many years, perhaps many years before Pixar was invented, at least I think before Pixar was a big thing at least, you invented the story spine, which is once upon a time, every day, but one day, because of that, because of that, and because of that, until finally, and ever since then, which is the structure that essentially is the one used in every single Pixar movie. But a lot of people refer to that not as the story spine, but as the Pixar pitch. I actually this morning I was listening to a friend of mine, a speaker called Brian Miller, talking about story. He does some of what he does is story work, and he mentioned the Pixar pitch. And I'm listening to it. He was like, "It's not the Pixar pitch. It's the story spine." so my first question to you is, what's your relationship with the fact that this thing you created has become so big, but not necessarily big, but not necessarily known for your thing as much as a lot of people know it as a Pixar thing.
Yeah, such is life, huh? I'll tell you how the whole thing happened. I invented the story spine back in 1990, late 1990, 91, when I was working with a theater company called Freestyle Repertory Theater in New York City. They perform Theater Sports New York. They're the New York home for theater sports, and they're an improvisational theater company, and that's where I learned everything. And when I started working with them, I was still in school studying playwriting and writing for the musical theater. That was my original interest in theater, was playwriting. And it was just about early 1990 when I started working with Freestyle Repertory Theater. And one of the early projects I did for them was directing their first full-length improvised play. We weren't doing anything like that back then. So I started improvising, learning short form in order to play theater sports. And I was all obsessed with playwriting at the time. And immediately I thought, why do we have to stop after 2 or 3 minutes and start a new scene? Why can't we improvise a full-length play just like I was learning how to write one? So I put together a bunch of tools in order to allow us to do that well. And one of them was the story spine, which, as you said, once upon a time, every day, but one day, because of that, because of that, because of that, until finally and ever since then. Now, I will be the first to admit that I did not invent story structure. I didn't invent the idea of a beginning and a middle and an end. All the story spine is a condensation of how great stories work. All good stories have a beginning and a middle and an end. And the story spine is just a condensation of the major points that bring us from one of those sections to the other. So it is descriptive, not prescriptive. It says what happens, not what you must do. Nonetheless, there I was using it in order to work with Freestyle Repertory Theater as we were rehearsing and developing our first full-length improvised play. And shortly after that, we traveled to San Francisco, where our sister company, Theater Sports, out here in San Francisco, Bay Area Theater Sports, or BATS, was holding a convention, a festival, and bringing people together. So when I was there, I ran a workshop on story structure and play structure, and I introduced the story spine. One of the people who was there was one of the founding directors of Bay Area Theater Sports, this wonderful improviser named Rebecca Stockley. So Rebecca learned the story spine from me. Then, I don't know exactly when, but a few years later, she started working at Pixar running improv workshops for their writing staff. And she taught the story spine to Pixar, and then it got picked up like that. So that's how it kind of traveled from New York, where I invented it, over to San Francisco, and eventually to Pixar. So I am proud and happy that the story spine is out there. And I credit a couple of people for letting the world know that I did invent it. And you are now the next one in a long line to whom I'm very grateful. So thank you very much for that. But I'm very glad it's out there. I certainly hold no ill will against anybody. I don't think anybody did anything purposefully in order to take credit for something that wasn't theirs. It was just the way these things work. And similarly, you know, I teach word at a time story. I have no idea who invented that. There are things that are just out there, and I'm very proud to have contributed to the treasure.
I doubt that was how it happened, but I would have loved that the story was. And one day I was in the cinema. I was watching this new movie that someone had told me about. It was called Toy Story. And then as soon as I started paying attention to the beats of the story, I went, hold on, hold on. I know exactly what's
Yes.
happening here.
Yeah. And again, I'll point out, you know, people have been telling great stories for thousands of years, right? Long before I came along. So again, I don't claim to have invented anything. I just claim to have discovered certain key elements that help shepherd a good story from its beginning into the middle and then into the end, and how they link, how you go from one section to the other.
Yeah, it was actually one of the questions I had for you, but you've covered it already. Was I wanted to know if you felt that you had created something from scratch, if you had uncovered it, or if you had just actually picked something that had been in the world, like the hero's journey, and just simplified it. Because yours is not the same as the hero's journey. There are some elements that are similar, but it's not actually the same structure. But I think that's common enough when we look at story structures or frameworks. Some people feel they created everything, but more likely than not, they simplified it or uncovered thinking that they had invented it, and then were told by other people that they hadn't, which was what happened to me in the avocado toast, which I genuinely felt I had invented until somebody had to point out to me that I had not.
Well, I still attribute avocado toast to you. So, yes, while I blush to put myself in any category that also contains Joseph Campbell or the hero's myth, I do think that is the similar process. Joseph Campbell studied myths from all around the world and took the key elements that they had in common and put them all together into his monomyth. And that's what I think the story spine is. You can take a look at all of the stories in the world, see how their beginnings lead to their middles, and their middles lead to their ends, and pull out these transitional moments that I found and call the story spine. So I discovered what was there and just made it simple so that people could see it more easily.
Yeah, because I think to one extent, what anyone that does any work with story is eventually and is paying attention, is there is no way not to hit upon the same sort of beats or the same sort of frameworks if you're actually trying to understand how this thing works, where perhaps yours highlighted something that to anyone who was very familiar with Joseph Campbell's work they should have known this already, but for other people that just think of stories as beginning, middle, and end, might not have been as obvious, is what comes before the problem and what comes after the problem. To my mind, the idea that the beginning needs to involve an ordinary life, or this is how life used to be, and then how that needs to be shown to be different at the end, is something that a lot of people don't get when they tell a story, or they just think of, what is it, they think of at the beginning, middle, and end, but they won't necessarily go, okay, what goes in the beginning? Is it just,
Mm-hmm.
where I am when the action happens. The end is when it ends. Is there anything missing there? So I think yours very clearly highlights those things in a way that more basic structures don't. I don't know if you felt there
Yeah,
was any
thank you.
other elements that you hadn't seen around when you came up with yours.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why the tool is helpful, because we are all intuitive storytellers. Human beings are simply storytelling animals, as I think there's a famous book called The Storytelling Animal. But just like any other art form, you can have a natural talent for it and an intuition for it, but there are still parts of it that you won't pick up unless you study it. So you have to practice music in order to understand the scales and harmonies and how it all works, even though you might have a natural gift for music. And I think the story spine helps one do that, because you can intuitively tell a story. Sometimes you'll hit gold, but sometimes you won't. And unless you know how stories work, you won't know why sometimes your intuitive stories are better than others. The story spine gives you something that you can use as an outlining tool or as a lens to look through in order to see, okay, where is my story idea not following along with the way organic stories work? And then you can go in and fix it.
Okay, so I really like that you said that, because one of the recurring conversations I had on this show is the one where I make a lot of story people nervous and I tell them that I don't really like story structures or that I don't believe in a story structure. And then, some people start like wanting to finish the conversation because clearly this guy doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. But the way I feel is that having both for this podcast and for my own development as a storyteller and someone who talks about storytelling professionally, I've read dozens and dozens of books on storytelling. I now must have heard hundreds of podcasts of people who are very well known in this world. And a lot of people have a story structure that they teach. And what I found is I said, okay, I have been telling stories for a while. I think I'm pretty decent at it. Let me actually try and use the story structures and see if it improves in any way what I'm doing. And what I tended to find was that I was trying to cram the things that happen and the way I would normally tell the story into a structure, and that sometimes wasn't a particularly good fit, or I kept thinking I needed the elements that were in the structure but my story didn't have those elements, and then does that mean that the story doesn't work? And I didn't think that that was the case. So where I've landed is that I think it's something like what you said earlier in the beginning. So you said that it's a descriptive tool, not a prescriptive tool. And where I've landed is a story structure is great as a checklist, but it's not necessarily what you sit in front of and try. It's not a fill in the blank thing. Is a, did I go wrong somewhere? Is there anything that I'm missing? Is there any other way of organizing this thing I've got now on the page that perhaps would flow a little better? So that's my feeling for most story structures, particularly for people that have some experience with storytelling. Is that what you meant by descriptive and not prescriptive?
Yeah. By descriptive, I mean we can look at stories, describe what they do, and then copy what they do, as opposed to just making up arbitrary rules and saying every good story needs to contain these. So you look at 10 great stories. What do they all have in common? Well, they all have a beginning in which there's some status quo. Then they all have something that happens that breaks the status quo and puts the hero or the main character into some sort of jeopardy or danger. Then that jeopardy escalates. Then there's a climax later on in which the hero is put on their path towards either success or failure. And then by the end, there's either success or failure. And that's just what happens. Like, look at a whole bunch of stories and you will see that's what happens. Not every story, of course, but the large majority of stories have this basic beginning, middle, and end. So we can learn from those stories. And when we are creating a story, we can have a status quo in the beginning. We can break it with an event. We can raise the stakes and then put the hero on a path towards success or failure. What I like about the story spine is that, like any of these structures for stories, I think it has to achieve two things. One is it has to be specific enough that it separates a story that follows it from one that doesn't. But it has to be broad enough that it doesn't alienate any idea for a story. So it has to be all encompassing, yet specific enough that it distinguishes some things from other things. So unlike the hero's journey, which is a very specific set of plot points that myths have in common, the story spine is not about plot points specifically. Like in the hero's journey, there is the call to adventure. Then the hero sets out and there's the guardian at the frontier that scares them away from leaving. And then later the belly of the whale where they are somehow incapacitated for some time, and that leads to growth. Like those are plot points. And not every story is going to have
cave.
Yes, right. And not every story is going
goddess.
to have those. Yes. Not every story is going to have those things. So you couldn't say that the hero's journey is a good model for any story you would ever want to write. It's only good if you want to write a myth, right? The story spine works for myths, but also works for any kind of story you would want to write, because it's not about a particular type of story. It is about the basic DNA of all stories.
Yeah, I think where the place where I have had more trouble with any story structure, not yours in particular, but any story structure in general, is because a lot of the types of stories that I traffic in are the very, very small day-to-day things. I'm home, my kid says something, and then we have a kind of a very short dialogue, and then all of a sudden it just flips completely my idea of how she sees the world. And those, it's really, really hard to stick them into any kind of structure. Like you can, but there is a chance that in trying to do that, you try and broaden a story that's really meant to be told in a minute or two, because you're trying to fill in some type of once upon a time and every day, and those things are probably not needed to get the impact of what that story is. So I think that's why I struggle with that.
Yeah, just to use the story that you just told as an example, we could say that the once upon a time and every day is you came home from work and your daughter was there. The but one day is your daughter said something to you. So you see, any series of events that has a beginning and a middle and an end feel to it can be, you can discover the story spine within it. And then you can make modifications to it if you want to, based on highlighting certain aspects and de-emphasizing others. So
Yeah,
like the once upon a time, the everyday, the routine, it doesn't have to be grand in scope. That's why I think the story spine is effective, because it works for any type of story, big or small, and something that feels like a traditional story or something that just feels like a little anecdote. It all can be analyzed through that lens.
Yeah, so I think there's also an element of your understanding of the structure is understandably substantially better or deeper than the schmuck like me who looks at the structure and starts making conclusions or assumptions about what goes where. I heard you on a different podcast, and you and the host of that show were doing the Romeo and Juliet in the story structure, in story spine, and then where she struggles with the end of it, because she's not quite sure at what point is the until finally, is when Juliet dies or pretends to die, and is that when Romeo kills himself. And your answer was, well, actually no, the until finally is when Romeo kills Juliet's cousin, and everything that comes after that is just a resolution. I don't think that that's a point that most people wouldn't have thought that was the case. I wouldn't think, at least not with a superficial understanding of what the story spine is.
Yeah. Well, two things I'll say. One is, first of all, there are two different tools at play. One is the story spine, which is that simple 8-line exercise. Then there's a much more elaborate model that I write about in that book, How to Improvise a Full-Length Play, which is very specifically about how plays are structured. And it largely fits the same model as the story spine, but it's much more intricate because plays do certain things that stories don't have to do, that all other kinds of stories don't have to do. So that analysis of Romeo and Juliet you're talking about was using a more elaborate structure than the story spine. It was using what I call the play-by-play structural model. The other thing is the host that you're talking about is my friend Kat. And to be very, very fair, I figured out Romeo and Juliet 20 years ago and have been using it ever since. So I just know that one because I've said it a million times. It's a very thick play with lots of stuff happening in it. And it is not surprising that someone who hasn't been, repeating the same script about it for 20 years would not see it as clearly.
Yes, I think you're being tremendously generous there with your analysis, but there's also the point that that where a story resolves itself is not always obvious to the person who's not neck deep into story. And the example that comes to mind here is I had an episode of this show that I love with a storyteller called Matthew Dix, who is the guy who's won more Moth Story Slams than anyone in history. And he's giving me the example. He always talks about how a story is about change, whatever is whatever state the character is in at the beginning, they will change by the end if the story is any good, and that's where the story really ends. Everything else is just resolution. And he gives the example of Jurassic Park and how the main character, I forgot the name of the actor now, Sam Neill. The character played by Sam Neill is this sort of gruff archaeologist, and he hates children, and he dates Laura Dern, and they're in a relationship. There's some tension because he hates children. You can kind of guess that probably she wants children, he doesn't like them, and then there is a point, maybe 3/4 of the way into the movie, where he's being really protective of the little kids when they're running away from the T-Rex. And Matthew said, that's where the story ends. His emotional arc is now over. He's now come to terms with the idea that he actually likes kids and he can probably have them if that's what his girlfriend wants. Everything else is just dinosaurs trying to kill people. Right? The important part is now over. And I don't think that that's the type of conclusion anyone, or the one you have from Romeo and Juliet is anyone that doesn't have a deep understanding of the stuff, they're not going to get that. Okay, you might tick the box. Oh no, I can see that happened, but in your mind, this is not the end of the movie. At least for most people, I don't think it would be.
Yes, correct. I don't know Jurassic Park well enough to really reflect upon its plot right now. I haven't seen it in many, many years. But certainly, I think reasonable people can look at the same story and have different interpretations of it, even using the same tool. Like if I very well understood, tell me the gentleman's name again that you were just referencing.
He has an unforgettable surname. His name is Matthew Dix.
Matthew Dix. If I was very familiar with Matthew's model, perhaps I could use his model, look at Jurassic Park, and still come up with a different answer to no, I think it's there, that, and use that model. And certainly people have analyzed plays using my models differently than I would analyze them. And sometimes I would say, oh, wow, that's a really good point. You're right. And sometimes not. So, a lot of it is still up to interpretation and a subjective viewpoint, perhaps. But there is something to be said for that moment, which I think Matthew might have been identifying, which in my model I refer to as the dramatic climax of the play. And the dramatic climax is that moment where the hero is set on their path towards success or failure. Now, there still might be a great deal of the movie left or the play left, but the fate is now set. The hero does something that puts them on this path, even though they don't know it yet, the audience doesn't know it yet, nobody knows it yet. But once the play is over, you can look back and say, oh, I see. If he didn't have that interaction with the kids, then they wouldn't have gotten married at the end. So you can find these moments that I call the dramatic climax, this moment in the story that doesn't end the story, but brings us from the middle into the ending. Now, the ending can last for quite some time, and that's all part of the story. So I wouldn't say the story's over, but I do understand Matthew's point of view. The important question concerning the main character is pretty much resolved, and now we're just watching everything play out around it.
Yes, it was a point more about how, in his mind, or his motto, as you would call it, it's that a story is about change. It's about a transformation of the characters and how they see the world and how they feel, how they interact with other people. So he always says that his kids won't let him watch movies with them because he spots whatever is happening in the first sort of 30 seconds of a movie and says, this is what's going to happen by the end. It's like, how can you possibly know that? It's like, well, it's a dog. He's at a pet shop. He's looking sad. Other dogs are being taken away. So, some family is going to take him in and he's going to find some friends. I mean, that's 100% that's going to happen. And they get really angry with him. So something else I heard you say, I think in that same podcast, was you were playing around with the story spine and people were using it to tell stories from their own lives. And I think you said something like, well, I haven't actually used the story spine to tell my story. And that had me thinking about limitations. Do you find that there are types of stories for which the story spine is not terribly well suited for, or that there are other structures that are substantially better? And I don't necessarily mean in the if you're writing a whole play, I realize that other things will come into play. But if you're thinking of shorter stories, the type of stuff you'd tell as a storyteller, are there limitations to the story spine or not?
Yeah. In my opinion, no. I do not think there are limitations to the story spine. I think that the story spine can fit on any other story structure there is. And that's one of the things I think that's powerful about it. Because again, it's not a series of very specific plot points or particulars that you need to accomplish. It simply identifies the beginning, the middle, and the end. So like you could use the hero's journey and write a myth, and the story spine would fit on top of that. You can use X story structure and write a screenplay, and the story spine can be found there too. So the story spine goes everywhere, I think. What I was referring to, I think, in that section of the podcast you're mentioning, is how people have found ways of applying the story spine to areas outside of creating fiction. And that was something that was really surprising to me, because I created the story spine as a way to create fiction, as a way to write stories. People like Kat Coppett and a million other people who spend a lot of time doing organizational development and life coaching and what we call applied improvisation, taking the improvisational technique and applying it to different areas in business or personal relationships, organizational development. They have found ways of using the story spine towards all of that. And one of those ways was having people tell their personal story using the story spine. So when I said I never used it for that, it's because I never used it for anything except creating stories. And so anytime people tell me stories about how they've been able to apply it to other areas of professional development or personal development, I'm just blown away by that, because I never even realized its potential.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, I'm not sure if this counts as a dichotomy, but there is this interesting feature of things like the story spine, is that they sometimes get taken completely out of context, and that might explain some of the challenges that some people, perhaps without having studied it deeply, find from it. For example, you said it, you created it to write fiction. You didn't necessarily create it to take a story from your own life and find a better way to tell it. Now, there's nothing to say that it couldn't be used that way, but that wasn't how it was originally intended. Like the hero's journey, in a way. The hero's journey wasn't intended as, this is how you write a story. It was, this is what stories are, not how you correct, don't tell, it's not tell your own story through this process. Is no, I've just broken down what stories actually look like. Then if you tell the story of your life, it will probably fit this criteria, because that's what is the DNA of a story. It's not a tool for writing stories. At least the hero's journey wasn't. Yours was. So
Right.
I think that's why I think some people bump up against the whole structure thing, and it's because sometimes it's being used for something that wasn't its original intention, at least.
Yeah, that's very smart. I'm sure that's true.
So something else I wanted to ask you was, because most of the world you live in is the world of fiction, so either through improv or through playwriting, right? And what has been your experience, or what have you found that works fantastically well in that world but doesn't apply to other types of storytelling? I'm not sure if you've thought of it in those terms, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, like I said before, the story spine is a simple model, and then that leads to this more elaborate model that I use for playwriting. And in playwriting, at least, and frankly, I would suggest this holds true for a lot of other types of stories as well, but certainly not all stories. In playwriting, one of the differences in the model is that in in a play we require what I refer to as two main characters. And this is what some people call the protagonist and the antagonist. I don't use those terms because I think they're a little bit hard to define. But I call them character one and character two. Romeo and Juliet, for example, character one and character two. And what holds true in a well structured play is that there's some dramatic question concerning those two characters. Will character one do something to or get something from character two? And the play raises that question by the middle of the play, by the center of the story. So the whole first half of the story is geared towards raising that question. Will Romeo find happiness in his marriage with Juliet? The whole second half of the play is dedicated to answering that question, either yes or no. It's always a yes or a no question. The That dramatic climax that I mentioned earlier, where Romeo kills Tybalt, that's the event that character one does that puts them on the road to the question either being yes or no. And by the end, it's yes or no. So that is one way in which play structure and screenplay structure, I would say, is different from maybe a myth or other types of stories. It really requires those two characters and requires a dramatic question that involves the fate of those two characters that has to be answered before the play can satisfactorily end.
And something else I heard you say now, might have been that same podcast, might have been a different one I came across when I was doing the research, and it was, I think you were I think you were complimenting the person that had tried to use the story spine, and saying how she had laid down enough groundwork so that when the conflict came later, we cared more about the characters because we understood it a little better. And then what I started thinking about is a lot of stories, perhaps not necessarily oral stories, but definitely in the movies, in TV shows, I think in the theater probably as well, use in media res. They start in the middle of the action and then fill us in gradually through the rest of the conflict. That's not how the story spine particularly is structured. But what is your take on that, other than a more chronological approach to the stories, to laying out the story?
Um, yeah, I think that's a wonderful observation. So here it is. The story spine is, like its name implies, just the bare bones of the structure. It is not the whole story. So just like our own spine, right? When you look at a person, you you know they're being held up by a spine, but you don't see their spine and you don't react to their spine. You react to the smile on their face and the texture of their hair and everything, the sparkle in their eyes, right? There's so much more that goes into making a person than the spine. But you need the spine. But that's not what the audience is paying attention to. They'll know if it's not there because it would just fall apart. But if it is there, they should be blissfully unaware of it, and they should be looking at everything else. So things like starting the story in the beginning, in the middle, or anything else that stories have other than the spine, like the character development, the setting, the beautiful language, all of the things that make us care and empathize about the characters, or pull us in with an exciting hook in the beginning. All of that is just other essential ingredients of the story, but it doesn't change the fact that stories have a beginning and a middle and an end. And in fact, even though in media res suggests that we're starting in the middle, we're not really. The beginning of the story is always the beginning of the story because the audience only gets the story in real time. So you sit down to see a play and it starts. One of my favorite TV shows, Alias, with Jennifer Gardner. You know, it always starts. You sit down, you turn on the TV, and it starts, and she's like running through a canyon, and they're shooting at her, and you have no idea where she is or how she got there. And then they shoot her in the head, and she dies. And then it says 48 hours earlier, and then we go back, and she's at a cocktail party, right? So even though that started with a scene from the middle, that scene from the middle was part of the beginning in the story that I saw as an audience member, because the beginning is everything that happens up until that routine is broken. So part of the once upon a time every day in a story that has a media res is that something happened before that you don't know about. And that's just part of the status quo that is going to be broken later on. So you can't really start a story in the middle. You have to start a story in the beginning, even if moments in the beginning are foreshadowing of something that's going to come later. And that's really all in media, that example of in media res. Another way of in media res of starting something in the middle is like two people just run into a room and they're breathing very heavily and they say, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. Yeah, right? Lock the door. Let's make sure they don't find us. So we're smack in the middle of something, right? For the characters, but not for the audience. For the audience, this is the very beginning. And they have all of the work to do in the beginning of building the status quo that they're going to break later.
Yeah, the example I always use is the beginning of Breaking Bad, where Walter White is wearing a shirt and no pants and holding a gun, and he's in the middle of the desert, and you hear the police sirens, and you think, what the hell is going on here? And then it backtracks. But one thing I've told people plenty of times when I'm helping them craft their stories is I always tell them that the story should start as close to the end as possible. And what I tend to find is, particularly if you're using dialogue, one line or two is often more than enough to establish what the status quo was. Because, you walk into the house and then, like, unlike what she always did, my daughter was whatever. And then you kind of establish that something is different and whatever. And I notice a lot that people, particularly if they don't use dialogue, something I was posting about today, if you don't use dialogue, there is a tendency to want to write out the beginning and set the context so people know what the hell you're talking about. Whereas if you use dialogue, you wouldn't do that because you just sound like terribly written dialogue and exposition. So you just find ways of saying, have you seen what our uncle is doing? You know what our uncle is like. Every Christmas is the same. Done. Right? I don't need to say anything else about my uncle.
Yes, I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. In fact, we do an annual retreat every year where we go away for a weekend and focus on a certain skill. And this last year, we were focusing on improvising 10-minute plays. And the big question was, what is the difference between a 10-minute play and a scene that lasts for 10 minutes? So what is the difference between a play and a scene? And one of the differences we discovered is that in a play, as you mentioned before from Matthew Dick's work, in a play, something fundamental has to change in the life of a character so that by the end of the play, their world is different than it was before in a meaningful, profound way. That's hard to accomplish in 10 minutes, especially if you have too much platform, too much foundation, because you only have 10 minutes to deal with the life altering change. So we discovered, similar to what you're saying, we need to start very, very close to the major problem, which usually comes in the middle of a play. So if you're doing a 2-hour play, you have like an hour to get there before you have to start winding things down. But if you're doing a 10-minute play, you only have like 2 or 3 minutes to get there before you have to start dealing with the ramifications of the crisis. So you want to start with just a few lines, 10, 12 lines of dialogue in order to take care of all of the foundation, everything in the beginning, and get to what makes today different real fast so that you have time to deal with the change that the character has to experience. So in that case, I think starting near the end, that's a very wonderful way of saying that.
So we kind of circled around the improv topic, and I wanted to ask, because I know this is something you've talked about and you used to like. Whose line is it anyway? Which is an amazing show. I absolutely loved it when they were showing it in Brazil. But I was always kind of in doubt when I watched that, because what I was in doubt was, is this real? Right? Are they actually improvising this in real time? I don't know if you know the actual answer to this, but was it real?
Oh, yes. I mean, I have no inside knowledge about that TV show. I had no involvement with it whatsoever. I just watched it on TV like everybody else. But in fact, I did have a friend who appeared on it for a season, I believe. And what I did understand from her, as well as from some other people over the years, is that, yes, it is all absolutely improvised. So they're not writing it or making it up or rehearsing it. But they do improvise many, many, many more scenes than they actually show in each episode. So, I'm making this up now, but let's say, they improvise for 2 hours and then they take the best 22 minutes and put that in the episode. So I don't think that takes anything away from what they accomplish, but at least that much is true.
I might be corrupting something you said for my own purposes, but is improv theater for playwrights who really want to act but can't?
I hope not. I hope not. But what I do think, the reason that I was so attracted to improvisation is because I enjoyed acting, but not enough to like really want to devote my whole life to it. I really loved doing it. I just loved everything about theater. So I grew up just loving acting. But when I discovered writing, then I really discovered a passion. And it was much more of a burning passion than acting. So I really started focusing on playwriting. Then I discovered improvisation and I realized, holy moly, this allows me to do all of the wonderful things I get to do as a playwright and have the fun of being on stage and entertaining an audience with it. So it brought together two things that I loved very much and allowed me to do it in a way that I never thought possible. I will admit that I think I am a better writer than I am actor. And I will tell you this, I cast myself in improv roles that I would never be cast as if I was out auditioning for roles. So I'm often playing the young leading man, and that's a role that that's a role that I wouldn't get if I was out auditioning for scripted theater. So, so that much is true.
Now, I'm gonna give you what might be a bit of a softball, but it's to me is a genuine question, because I'm someone who, as much as I fully recognize the many different transferable skills you can get from improv into the real life or the corporate world or whatever. I'm on the one hand the type of person who hates improv. I think that says more about my own psychology than improv itself. But also, I was wondering why the skill of writing a story or developing a story in the improv style. Why would someone want to learn that or focus on learning that over, for example, um, I mean, it's not that this is not exactly the story spine, but for example, more what I do. So my focus is more is in finding stories from real life, figuring out what the point of those stories are, and using that to communicate more effectively. So, which is a completely different approach than the improv type of storytelling. So, why would you suggest, as I'm sure you have plenty of times, people should practice that and can get a lot from that? What's the real appeal or the real advantage over other types of storytelling, for example?
Well, that's a great question. So I think there are many layers to the answer there. So the first question is, if you are not interested in performing improvisation, then I don't think there's any great benefit to learning my play structure through improvisation. You might as well just learn it through playwriting, because the play structure is the play structure. And it's the same if you're improvising a play or writing a play. So your written plays will be better if you use my structure, and your improvised plays will be better if you use my structure. But if you don't want to improvise, there's no reason to learn how to improvise. Just study the structure and then write it. So that's my answer to that. And then another answer is that there are all types of benefits to studying improvisation, whether you study how to improvise a full-length play or just a beginning improv class, which teaches the basics of improvisation. And one of those benefits is it frees up your creativity, and it teaches you how to accept your own offers, how to have an instinct, and rather than shelve it or decide it's not good enough, to accept it and build on it and go with it. So a lot of times when writers write, and I'll speak personally, when I write, it is a painstaking experience, and you sit there and you think and you get an idea and you reject it and you type something and you think it's not good enough. There's something so permanent about putting something on the page that makes you feel like, oh, it has to be perfect right now. And then you say, oh, now I have writer's block. I can't think of anything to write. But of course, that's not true. You can think of things or you'd be dead, right? As long as you're alive, you're thinking of things. But what you mean is you're not happy with anything that you're thinking about. So what improvisation does is it helps free up the creativity of the writer by allowing them to write as spontaneously as an improviser improvises.
I'm not sure if there was ever a sentence that was truer than what you just said, that we are constantly thinking of things, but we're not happy about the things we are thinking about.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of improvisation. You can't do that. The whole point of improvisation is as soon as that instinct occurs to you, you've got to express it. And that is very freeing as a writer, because we don't give ourselves that permission often.
To me, it's somewhat mysterious why I dislike the idea of improv as much as I do, because one of my favorite things when I'm on stage is when I get to improv. Somebody shouts something from the audience and I have to react to that, or it's a Q&A after a keynote, and then to some degree I'm not following a script of any type. I haven't rehearsed it. And even when I do workshops, one of my favorite things to do in the workshop is teach people a structure for a presentation and then have them choose a topic, and with them very quickly come up with something, and then without any rehearsal I'll get what they've told me and present it back to them. So I don't know if it's I think I like it when I do it, but I don't like it if there's five people on stage doing it with me.
Um,
I don't know.
yes. Well, I have a thought about that, and it
Please.
is that very often improvisation is performed by people who are not good actors, are not good writers, and are not good stage directors. People study only improvisation and then get in front of an audience and claim that they're going to improvise theater. You see, they don't say that, but that's what they're doing, and they don't even know it. So they go up on stage, but there's nothing that is compelling. Not fair. Not that there's nothing that's compelling to watch, but the audience is not treated to a great piece of theater because they might be watching people who know how to improvise, but they're not watching people who know how to act, write, or direct. And if you're going to entertain an audience thoroughly with a piece of theater, especially a long piece of theater, it has to be good theater. It can't just be good improvisation. It has to be good theater. You're not just improvising, you're improvising theater. So if more people understood that and spent the same amount of time studying acting, directing, and writing as they do studying improvisation, there would be more improvisation that would make an audience think, oh, there's really something here. This is not just people horsing around.
Well, there is something else which, if I dig not terribly deep into my psyche, I know to be true, and I think this might resonate with a lot of people that don't like improv, not necessarily because they dislike it, perhaps because they're just terrified of it, is that I think there's always that fear of not showing up as your best self. I'm someone who, if I have any type of stage presentation that I have to do, be it storytelling or speaking or training, I will plan for it. I will probably practice and rehearse it, and depending on the level of importance, I'll practice and rehearse it a ton. So, I'll rehearse it until it looks like I haven't rehearsed, and it's all very natural and improvised. But I care about what happens on the stage, and I want to deliver my best work. And improv in that sense is nerve wracking because as much as you can have practice on the thing itself, you're not going to have practice on the particular scenes. So I think there might be an element of, well, I want to look good on stage, and I might not, and I don't like that feeling when I go on stage. I like the
um,
stage, but I like to know I'm going to be good on stage. I don't want to be terrified that I'll completely suck.
yes. In that way, improvisation has something in common with playing sports or doing something like a circus where there's some element of potential failure to the daring feat you're about to do. You do practice, of course, like you said. If you're a professional baseball player, you practice a lot, even though the game is going to be improvised based on what happens out on the field. So we do try to prepare ourselves as much as possible to be successful on stage through practice, but then there is that element of risk. So just like if you're a acrobat, you're going to practice and practice and practice, and you're going to go out and you're going to try to do this amazing flip from one trapeze bar to the other, and you might fall. And nobody wants to fall, but part of the thrill for the audience is knowing that you might. And that's that added one added layer of entertainment that improvisation has. When an audience is watching, they're experiencing two things at the same time. They're experiencing the play you're improvising for them, and they're empathizing with the characters and following the story and wondering what's going to happen, just like any play. But then they're also on this meta level enjoying the fact that they're making this up. And at any moment, they might not be able to put the pieces together. Or like, oh my goodness, how did they possibly put that puzzle together at the end there when they had no idea that that's where they were going? So it's that extra level of potential failure that adds that kind of extra level of entertainment that improvisation offers as an art form.
Yeah, this is the moment where I in a way sort of regret that in my older and slightly less immature age have gotten some self-awareness, because this look from the outside of I think they're winging it and it could completely collapse any moment now is the one I have when I look at my life with any amount of detachment. I'm watching
Yes.
it play out in real time and I know I'm prepared enough and I should just about be able to land this, but who knows?
What is that? The imposter syndrome, right?
So people love talking about imposter syndrome, but and it's true to some degree, but as I don't believe you disagree, if you are a performer, you know how much effort it goes into getting to a level of skill and confidence that you can deliver a performance of a certain level. And the more variables there are in that performance, the more of a chance that something is not going to land. I do keynotes for most of the time. I don't do improv, so I know my stuff. I know my text. I know what should happen, but I can't account for not every audience finds the same things funny. Not every audience gets emotional about the same things. So there are variables that I have to maneuver while I'm up on stage. So even in a slightly more controlled environment like that one, it's not like I'm winging it. I'm not winging it, but it would be a lie if I said I know 100% how that's gonna play out. I know exactly how much they're gonna enjoy or learn from it. Because if it ever got to that point, it would be so boring, and I'll have to start trying to do more difficult things or dealing with more difficult audiences or preparing less, so I got the thrill of being on stage. Because otherwise, if it can't go wrong given a little bit, where is the excitement in that, right?
Yes,
At least
right. I mean,
that's how.
not to mention, is the technology going to fail? Right? Does you can't get the slideshow to work? Like those types of things happen all of the time. So there's
Yeah.
always some element of risk. I mean, even with a scripted play, you can forget your lines. You can, a prop might not be there when you need it. So nothing that we do in our world, I think, is completely risk free. It's just that when the audience is watching improvisation, they are more keenly aware of the risks,
Yeah,
right?
I
Like
think.
everyone sitting watching your script is
Yeah.
expecting it to go right.
Yeah, I think that there is, with virtual presentations, with speakers have been put in this weird position that couldn't exist in the real world, where if you're if the tech you're using or that the host is using doesn't allow for a great deal of interaction, which is what happened to me in a presentation a couple of weeks ago, I could barely use the chat or have other people use the
Mm-hmm.
chat. I couldn't see the audience. I could only see the host. So I had to deliver a 45-minute presentation where I basically can't interact with anyone. So
Hmm. Yeah.
if it was a recorded presentation, it would essentially be the same thing as far as the audience is concerned because I'm not interacting with them. But apart from that, even in cases where it's going really well, I think once you got into a certain level of performance, there is something happening, at least in my brain, where I'm thinking, okay, that part of the humor landed really well. This other part, not so much. So maybe I should adjust this bit that's coming a bit further down the line because it's not going to land the way I want to. So even when it's going well, when you're doing stuff you're familiar with, there's always adjustment and there's always, well, that was funny. Can I make it funnier? Can I play this up? So I think
Hmm.
but at all times I'm thinking there is no guarantee this is going to work. It often works, but not every time. So
Yes, yes, that's true. One reason why practicing improvisation is helpful for people who perform scripted theater or keynote presentations like you do is it gives you an extra level of comfort with that knowledge. So you know things are might fail, and that makes you nervous, right? Because you want everything to go well. When you practice improvisation, you become comfortable, more comfortable with that element of risk, and so you go out there and you are less worried about things going wrong because if things go wrong, you have a higher level of confidence that you'll be able to adapt.
yeah, and I think to a point that I'm not sure if anyone who is a big advocate of improv, sells it that way, but perhaps you should and they should, is to people that have any level of anxiety in their lives, either at work or just with everyday life, sometimes there's this tendency to try and control for everything, and thinking that the solution to anxiety is knowing how everything is going to happen exactly, like it's going to be this and then it's going to be that, so I'm okay, I don't have any reason to be concerned. And I think in many aspects of my life, at least, what I have learned is you don't feel confident because you know exactly how things are going to play out. You feel confident because you know you can handle them however they play out, which is a very
Yes.
big difference. Yeah.
Yes, that's very well said. And that is exactly what improvisation develops. So even if you are not interested in performing at all on stage, it's still valuable to practice improvisation because it trains on certain things. One thing is improvisers have to learn how to give up control. When you're improvising, you are one small part of a collaborative process, and you can't have an idea that takes us all the way from the beginning to the end and then shoehorn it in and expect everybody to follow suit. You can't control what happens. So just like in life, you cannot control what happens. And in life, as you say, a lot of our stress comes from wanting to control what happens. And improvisation helps us give that up. And then you can apply what you learn in the improv studio to life. There's a lot of connection, in fact, between improvisation and mindful meditation. And that has to do with the improvisational skill of being in the moment. The way I teach improvisation, there's 3 rules of improvisation: be spontaneous, make your partner look good, and build on your partner's idea. That first rule, be spontaneous, has a couple of levels of meaning. The first is, like we were talking before about writing and writer's block, is accept your own creativity. If you have an instinct, put it out there, share it, and let other people build on it rather than hiding it. But the other and deeper level of spontaneity involves being in the moment and really understanding what's happening in the moment and not trying to control or fix it, but just accept it, understand it, and react appropriately to it. And that's what you do when you practice mindful meditation. You practice just being in the moment, being aware of what's happening to you, and acknowledging it. So those 2 tools are helpful and applicable to life in the same way, which is if you're stressing out about what's going to happen tomorrow, improvisation and meditation help you experience what's happening now without worrying so much about tomorrow.
Well, I am a dedicated meditator, and as delightful as this conversation has been, I think I probably should end it before I talk myself into improv, which might make me reassess my many choices in my life with a closer scrutiny that I'm perhaps not ready for. Ken,
with my luck, you'll start improvising. You'll go out on stage and your pants will accidentally fall down or something.
Yes.
You'll have the worst experience of your life.
Yes. Which would be, content for stories, which is my philosophy in life is, did it work or did it make for a good story? That's pretty much all you need to know about anything that happened in your life. So if people want to find out more about the stuff you're doing, other than watching any Pixar movies, what else, where can they go?
Well, they can go to the website, synergytheater.com, SYNERGYTHETER, synergytheater.com. I teach online classes, so we have online beginning improv classes as well as experienced master classes, specifically in improvising a full-length play. And then if anybody is local to the Northern California Bay Area, that's where we teach in-person classes in Berkeley, California, and we perform our shows in Walnut Creek at the Lesher Center for the Arts.
Amazing. I'll put most of the stuff in the show notes, and I also tell Kathy Cloth Guest that we had this conversation. I believe she's a friend of yours and a previous guest of this show.
Oh, how wonderful. I'll connect with her. It's funny because Kathy and I only know each other through Facebook. I've never actually met her, but we've
Okay.
developed this friendship on Facebook. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not going to start a conversation now that I've had many times at home whereas my wife and I disagree if you can actually be friends with people that you haven't met in real life. Uh, I I am of the opinion that you can, but every time I say, this friend of mine, it's like, I know all your friends. Who is this person? Oh, someone really, it's not a friend. It's not.
Well, you could tell your wife that I now consider you my friend.
See, but if I tell her, there's like, you just met him. You're just making my point for me.
And then I'll really mess you up. I'm going to start calling your home and leaving weird messages.
That might sell it better. That's my friends. Yeah. All right. Thank you again for your time, Ken. This has been amazing.
My
All right,
pleasure.
everyone.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time.